Hello, I'm Lynne O'Donnell. Welcome to Insights, a new series of interviews with generals, journalists, diplomats and activists who have front row seats at the conflicts around the world. Joining me today is retired US Army General David Petreaus. He's the most famous living American military figure in the world today. He commanded US and NATO forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. He was the 10th Commander of US Central Command and Director of the CIA. These days, he advises civilian and military leaders on strategy. I talked to him around the release of his latest book, Conflict, the Evolution of War from 1945 to Ukraine, which he wrote with the historian Andrew Roberts. Of course, we talked about much more than just his book. Have a listen. General David Petreaus, it's very nice to be talking to you. And as we talk, the world is at war, and you know war. You were in the US Army for 37 years and commanded US and coalition troops in Iraq and then Afghanistan, where we met. And you were confirmed unanimously as CIA Director, a post you held until 2012. And now, among other things, of course, you're writing books. And we're meeting to discuss your new book, which is called Conflict, the Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine, which you've co-written with British historian Andrew Roberts. It was published before the Hamas attacks on October the 7th on Israel and Israel's declaration of war, but we'll come back to that. So first, I would like to ask you, what are the major changes or evolutionary impacts of warfare that you're aiming to capture in your book?
Well, maybe I might answer better, actually, what was the biggest takeaway from writing the book. And in that case, what Andrew and I recognized was the crucial importance in conflict of strategic leadership. That is leadership at the very top, at the top of the civilian structure, President of the United States, Prime Minister of the UK, whatever. And then it's the leadership on the battlefield, the senior commander who is turning the really big ideas at the civilian level into a strategic campaign plan and then reality on the battlefield. And in essence, strategic leaders have to perform 4 tasks. And if you want to hope to prevail in a conflict, they have to be performed very well indeed. The first is to get the big ideas right, to understand all the elements of the context, both again at the very highest political level and then at the very highest military level, so that that strategy that is determined and then implemented is the right one for all of these circumstances. Second is to communicate the big idea as effectively throughout the breadth and depth of the organization that the strategic leader is overseeing, but also to everyone who has a stake in the outcome of that particular conflict. Then to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. This is what we normally think of as leadership, by the way. This is the example that the leader provides, the energy, the inspiration, the determination. It's how the leader spends his or her time, literally we called it the battle rhythm, your schedule, your calendar. That's very, very important because what you do obviously shows what you think is most important. And all of the myriad meetings and battlefield circulation efforts and all the rest of that, these are the ways that a strategic leader drives the execution of a campaign plan. It's also the metrics, which have to be right. We have a number of examples in the book where the metrics were both flawed and then lacked integrity in the actual reporting, the body count in Vietnam being principal among those. And of course, it is attracting the very best and brightest individuals to the organizations that are overseeing the conflict, and then allowing those who aren't measuring up to move on to something else. And then there's a final task, which has to be done formally. In other words, it has to be on the strategic leader's battle rhythm in various ways. And that is to sit down and determine how you need to refine the big ideas, how you need to refine the strategy, the campaign plan, the policies, practices, individual programs, so that they can be communicated and then implemented, and you do the process again and again and again. And I think this was the single biggest revelation for each of us. I sensed this. I think I knew this already because I had developed this intellectual construct that I've just described for you before I went back for the surge in Iraq, and then used it during that command, and then subsequently at U.S. Central Command, and also in Afghanistan, and also at the CIA. By the way, it's also an intellectual construct that applies in any field of endeavor, not just combat, not just conflict, but also in the civilian sector, the nonprofit world, heck, your family, whatever it may be. And so again, I think that construct's hugely important. And every leader at every level does perform these four tasks. The difference is that at the strategic level, the senior civilian, the senior military commander, they have to get the big ideas right. Everyone else below them is indeed identifying the big ideas at their level, but they're doing so within the intent, within the limits, within what the senior leader, the strategic leader, has decided on as the strategy. And so it's crucial that the strategic leader get the big ideas right. And we could recount a number of cases in various wars in which leaders failed to do that. Other cases in which leaders came in and made adaptations, refined the big ideas, overhauled them considerably, and got it right. And then some others that were literally a mix of the two of those. And I submit that the surge in Iraq, which 4 years into the Iraq War, was a complete reversal of what we'd been doing before. In other words, 180-degree different in the biggest of the big ideas, which was that we had to live with the people to secure them, and we had to take back control of security from the Iraqi security forces. We'd been doing the opposite in each case prior to the surge. And that the surge that mattered most wasn't the additional forces, the 25 or 30,000 American additional forces. It was rather the surge of ideas, and which again highlights how crucial that particular task of a strategic leader is.
Indeed. Well, the war in Ukraine appears as an old-fashioned ground-air war fought in trenches and at close range with tanks and bombs, but it's also marked many firsts in the evolution of war, and this is something that your book makes clear, such as the use of social media and open source information. Can you list these firsts and their impact in Ukraine, and as a strategist, on the future of war?
Sure. I think Ukraine is best characterized the way that Max Boot, the great Washington Post columnist, has noted when he said that Ukraine is what happens when All Quiet on the Western Front meets Blade Runner, because you have elements that are literally of the First World War, trenches, barbed wire, all the rest of this. You have Second World War, massive artillery and quite substantial armor forces. Cold War, the armored elements that are actually on the battlefield are from that era. When I was a major, for example, serving as a brigade operations officer along the inter-German border during NATO days, we were facing the same tanks that we see in the battlefield now, T-62, T-72, T-80s, and so T-64s and so forth. And on the western side, we had the tanks that we're now giving, albeit with upgrades, to Ukraine as well. But then, as you noted, you also see some extraordinary advances, increasingly sophisticated use of unmanned systems. The Ukrainians in particular have used maritime drones so effectively that they've essentially forced the Russians to withdraw the bulk of the Black Sea Fleet from the Crimean port of Sevastopol. More recently, they've even gone after one of the other ports that's even at a greater distance from their southwest coast, which is presumably where they're launching these. at a repair facility on the other side, which again will limit very substantially what they're able to do in terms of repair, and if they're still trying to do any manufacture and production. You'll also see the advent of suicide drones that are quite sophisticated. We've even seen the Russians use a hypersonic missile system, the Kinshal, which happily was shot down by the Petreaus system that the U.S. provided to Ukraine. So you see lots and lots of these advances as well. And then in terms of the context, you rightly noted that we've never had a war that has been so transparent and open, because everyone in the battlefield has a smartphone and can take videos and photos, and then have access to the internet, can upload them on various social media platforms. So all kinds of ways in which this war is first a throwback to the past, and then a vision of the future, although it is not what we envision. The very highest of high-end war will be in the future, which will be that in which there are innumerable numbers of unmanned systems, and again, not just in the air or on the sea, but subsea, on the ground, outer space, and the equivalent in cyberspace, and where increasingly these systems are not remotely piloted, but they are algorithmically piloted. In other words, where the human in the loop becomes the human on the loop, the human who actually writes the software program that captures the conditions that the machine has to meet, which are established obviously by a human as well, before that machine can take a kinetic or non-kinetic action. But again, vast numbers of these, much, much more capable, some of them traveling at hypersonic speeds and maneuvering right before impact, which makes it very, very difficult to defend against. And this will require, over time, the transformation of the high-end, most high-end capabilities in the top-tier countries from a world that is simplistically described as a small number of large platforms, which are incredibly capable, heavily manned, exquisite almost in their abilities, but also increasingly vulnerable, because an old adage from NATO, which was not true back in those days, is true now, and that holds: what can be seen can be hit, what can be hit can be killed. So you have to transform from that force structure, not completely by any means. You still want some of those systems, but fewer of them, so that you could make many, many more unmanned systems. In other words, a large number of smaller unmanned systems of all different types in all domains, and increasingly algorithmically piloted rather than remotely piloted.
Well, I studied Clausewitz at master's level at King's College, London, after a long career on modern post 9/11 battlefields as a journalist. And I had thought, before going on to my further studies, that the notion of fighting for the nation state was an outmoded concept after Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Taliban, the fight for the caliphate. But it seems not so, Ukraine and Israel being examples, I guess. But Clausewitz is the central figure of your book. How would you describe the modern landscape? Transitional, perhaps, or hybrid, a meld of old and new technologies, psychopathies, methodologies, goals? Is the democratic free world equipped to fight for its survival in this new, yet to be defined landscape?
I believe that it is, but the way to answer your question, I think, is to say that the future will be all of the above.
Mm-hmm.
And it's for that reason that you can't do what we did after Vietnam in the U.S., which was consign the lessons of Vietnam to the ash heap of history in the hope that we would never again do something as frustrating as that.
Yeah.
Because, of course, that's what we did in the wars of the post 9/11 period. And because we'd consigned the lessons of Vietnam and essentially counterinsurgency studies to the ash heap of history, we didn't even have a doctrinal field manual until actually I came home between the 3 and 4 star tours in Iraq. And a great team and I, together with the team from the Marine Corps with General Mattis, put one together in less than a year. But you know Clausewitz, and we, of course, quote Clausewitz at several different times, along with Churchill, another great source of wonderful quotes. And the one that sticks out for me is the one that is at the beginning of the Vietnam chapter, America's War in Vietnam chapter, because we also talk about the French in Indochine. And I should just note that the arrangement that the great Andrew Roberts and I had was that I would do the Iraq and Afghanistan chapters, also Vietnam, Iraq and Afghanistan, obviously, given that I've been a participant in those, and then Vietnam, because that was the subject of my dissertation when I was doing my PhD at Princeton. And then we would basically swap back and forth the others, just playing back and forth. Andrew might draft the first, and then we would literally send hundreds of emails, ultimately thousands, back and forth. But the quote from Clausewitz to begin Chapter 3, America's War in Vietnam, I think may be the most important one in the entire book. He notes that the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment that the statesman and commander have to make is to establish the kind of war on which they are embarking, neither mistaking it for nor trying to make it into something that is alien to its nature. This is the first of all strategic questions and the most comprehensive. And to that, I'd add also the most important by far, because again, this is what guides your development of the big ideas of the strategic approach you're going to take. In Vietnam, for example, the Vietnamese, when we entered after the withdrawal of the French and the partition of Vietnam into northern Vietnam, the South Vietnamese wanted our help in dealing with what essentially was guerrilla or insurgent warfare in the villages and hamlets. And we, weighed down by the lessons of Korea, which we had just been fighting, said, no, what you need is not a counterinsurgency campaign. You need big forces. You need divisions just like ours, because the big threat is the North invading the South across the demilitarized zone. Again, looking at this through the prism of the recent experience in Korea. So, but to come back to your question, the bottom line is that we have to be ready for all of these different types of conflicts, including nation-state warfare, defense of the homeland, all the rest, because we are involved still in counterinsurgency campaigns. Yes, we may be doing it through what might be termed advise, assist, and enable. So we're helping a host nation or a local partner to deal with it, as we are in Iraq and northeastern Syria, where we're helping local partners to keep an eye on the Islamic State and ensure that it cannot do what it did before, right after our combat forces left and the Iraqis took their eye off it, which was to reconstitute. So we're helping the Iraqi security forces and the Syrian democratic forces keep an eye and pressure on the remnants of the Islamic State so that, again, it cannot reconstitute. We're doing the same in a variety of other places around the world with modest forces, but clearly we have to retain that expertise. We're certainly engaged still in counterterrorism force operations, very strictly defined, not just counterinsurgency, a broader category. Of course, we're helping other countries as they battle the forces of a nation state. In the case of Ukraine, fighting its war of independence, with Russia fighting for its national survival. In the case of supporting Israel against an organization that has just carried out the most horrific attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust, and so on. But also, of course, ensuring that our forces are capable at the very highest end of the conflict spectrum of conflict, so that deterrence is maintained. And here, of course, you think most significantly of that in the Indo-Pacific area, including, of course, on the Korean Peninsula, but then more broadly speaking, between the U.S., our allies and partners, and, of course, the People's Republic of China, hoping that we never have to fight with them. Would all like to see, in fact, a much more mutually beneficial relationship than the severe competition as the relationship is characterized now by the U.S. National Security Advisor. But you have to deal with the world the way it is, not the way you would like it to be. And so therefore we have to ensure that the elements of deterrence, which are the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to employ them on the other, that is not ever questioned. And I think there are a lot of efforts in that regard, including not just the hardening of our bases, the dispersion of our forces in that region, the augmentation of defenses of various locations, weapon systems, bases, putting hard headquarters underground, all of this, but also that transformation of our capabilities that we really need to accelerate, actually, again, from the very small number of very large platforms to a very massively large number of small unmanned systems.
Well, you've brought us very neatly to China and the US decision to tilt to the Indo-Pacific, the protection of Taiwan, AUKUS. The FBI recently hosted the Five Eyes guys in California to discuss the threat of China and its use of AI in the misinformation and disinformation space. Given the current global security landscape, how much of a threat do you think China poses? And if we assume that China is not a true superpower rather than a big country with a lot of ambition, does the United States have the capacity to manage all the threats to global security in order to maintain its status as the true sole superpower?
Well, China is a superpower without question. I think it's a superpower economically, and it certainly is a superpower in terms of its security forces, in which it has invested a great deal in the past decade or more in particular, albeit not with the capabilities that the U.S. has, but not focused on the entire world the way the U.S. has to, rather focused on a subset of the world, if you will, while certainly expanding its military, spreading its wings and expanding the areas in which it is active. But yes, the U.S. is capable of keeping all of these plates spinning, if you want to use the metaphor of the guy in the circus who does that, keeping in mind that we have others that help us do that. So various allies and partners around the world, in some respects increasingly, are helping us to keep those plates spinning. Again, different plates for different allies and partners. But unquestionably, the U.S. does have to lead this particular effort. And it should appreciate its allies and partners and work hard to strengthen the various relationships that manifest them. And I think we are. But again, this also underscores why we have to have capabilities all the way up and down the spectrum of conflict. In fact, you should really even start by what's called support to domestic authorities, which is right in the U.S. homeland, helping in major cases of, say, disaster relief or combating a pandemic or a variety of other domestic situations in which the military has enormous scale and capability that cannot be found even in some of our emergency management agencies and state and local elements.
Well, let's turn to AI. And its role in future warfare. It used to be the case that the US military was the innovator and inventor of technologies that then became part of everyday life, cell phones, internet, whatever. But technology is now in the hands of billionaires, and Elon Musk proved the volatility of this situation with Starlink. He decided how and where and for how long and for what purpose it could be used in Ukraine. How will this fact of life, the personalization and the politicization of vital technology, impact security and warfare and strategy and planning?
Well, first of all, the U.S. still is very much the inventor and innovator in the security realm and in many other realms as well, I would add. In fact, by and large, leading in the AI sector. But there are other countries that clearly have advanced dramatically, and China would be probably foremost among those. And then beyond that, the innovation that we have often sparked or funded or propelled has often been carried out by private sector partners. So that's not unique. In fact, frankly, it's where the innovation is most significant these days in the United States, in the UK for that matter, and in numerous other countries. It's the private sector in which the rewards are the greatest, frankly, where the agility is the most significant, where the bureaucracy is the least, and so forth and so on. Although, yes, once they get to the scale of the major industrial companies in the defense space or any other space, needless to say, the sense of agility sometimes can be a bit less. And of course, when you're talking about massive, major programs, you've got to have a lot of bureaucracy. You have to have lots of detail and contracts and all the rest. And that obviously means that you're not able to turn on a dime. But in any event, I think that innovation and entrepreneurship and invention all are continuing at a very rapid pace. And in the case of Starlink, yes, there was an interruption of the service, and then the Department of Defense took it over. So the DoD is paying for Starlink for Ukraine, and it's on all the time, without interruption and without interference by the CEO of that particular effort.
Okay. Do you think that NATO is still relevant? It's being bolstered and expanded, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine has spurred members like Germany to, meet their 2% obligations. Yes, you think it's relevant, but can it function and can it be trusted to function as anything more than an adjunct of US power?
Well, I mean, you have to understand that the essence of NATO is the U.S. foundation. Yeah. And we have seen this repeatedly. We saw it in Afghanistan, that when the U.S. decided to withdraw, all the other countries, many of them NATO members, had wanted to stay, but could not without the United States. So again, I think to accomplish something significant, the U.S. is going to have to provide the foundation, the base piece, and a considerable degree of leadership. That's not to say, though, that NATO can't carry out lesser included activities, and it has done that with a considerable degree of success in the former Yugoslavia and so forth. So, but again, if it's going to be really big, you're going to need the really big partner, and that is the U.S. Keep in mind that the U.S. doesn't just spend more on defense than all of its now 30, I guess it is, NATO partners together, allies together, with one more waiting in the wings, Sweden. It spends more than 2.3 or something like that, all of them put together. So and all the rest of them are, to varying degrees, a bit fragmented in terms of the capabilities. They're certainly not as robust as is the U.S. And so there are several countries that have very significant capability, but even they can't shoulder the foundational effort that is required of the United States to enable a NATO mission of scale to go forward.
Can we turn to Africa?
And I say that, with respect, I say that having been a NATO officer as well as a U.S. officer at the same time, but a NATO officer as a major, as a brigadier general, that major at SHAPE headquarters, a brigadier general in the former Yugoslavia, a 3-star in Iraq, where I was the commander of the NATO training mission, as well as the U.S.-led multinational security transition command Iraq, and then the 4-star commander in Afghanistan, which was both a U.S. forces and a NATO forces hats that I had there.
Can we turn to Africa, sir, which doesn't get a lot of space in your book? China and Russia have both staked claims to influence, develop, exploit and divide a number of African countries. And given the levels of poverty and corruption, if I may, across the continent, they've largely been welcomed, at least by the leadership of a number of countries on the continent there. What are your concerns, and what should be the US Western priorities in Africa?
Well, the concerns are that you have, in many of the countries of Africa, by no means all, but in many, you have inadequate security, numerous different threats, but principal among them that of various Islamist extremist groups. In some other cases, essentially civil wars, and in other cases, large criminal entities. You have lack of adequate governance, lack of integrity in government governance, and a variety of other challenges, corruption certainly, and a variety of other challenges that just make it very difficult to invest in Africa when it comes to large Western firms. That's not to say there aren't lots of investment opportunities in Africa, but not of the scale that, say, a company like the one in which I'm a partner, KKR, seek, because we do big deals. When you have $528 billion under management, you don't do small deals. So that's number one challenge, which means that competing with the Belt and Road Initiative is very, very difficult. That obviously is a state-run endeavor. There aren't the concerns about corruption, inadequate governance, the environment, and so forth, nor, frankly, in many cases, the people of the country in employing them and using their skills in the design and materials and construction. So that's a big, big challenge. And then because of the levels of corruption, as you noted, there's a willingness to use organizations like Wagner, which are essentially mercenary outfits that don't much care about, again, the environment, how the workers are treated, corruption, and all the rest. And therefore, some of the leaders of some of these countries are, frankly, comfortable with having them. They also don't care much about violations of the Geneva Convention and the law of land warfare. So we've seen, very sadly, the withdrawal of French forces from a number of countries in West Africa. You've seen a number of coups in some of those same countries. And then you've seen the expansion of Islamist extremists in those same countries. So it's a downward spiral. Again, that's very concerning, as is also the challenge when it comes to investing in countries that have extraordinary quantities of strategic minerals, especially when it comes to those needed for the transition to renewable energy and associated technologies, especially electric vehicles and so forth. And the U.S. and the West still haven't really come to grips with how to deal with that, other than with what are fairly modest programs from the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, Agency for International Development, and their equivalents in other Western countries.
Looking at the situation in the Middle East post-October the 7th, how much of what is happening there and in other places facing non-state existential threats like Pakistan, Somalia, what's going on in Kashmir, for instance, how much of that do you think is directly connected to the US departure via the Doha Agreement from Afghanistan?
Well, clearly the Taliban took over is the most significant takeover of Afghanistan is the most significant manifestation or the significant development, one that I believe is both tragic and heartbreaking and also disastrous, frankly, and one to which we had an alternative. Beyond that, certainly Afghanistan and its lack of governmental control of certain of the areas has meant that the Pakistani Taliban, the Tehreek Taliban Pakistani, TTP, has been able to find safe havens on Afghan soil from which it can conduct forays back into Pakistan and carry out quite significant attacks on the Pakistani security forces and other entities. We've seen the Islamic State trying to establish a more substantial presence in Afghanistan. It also is active in Pakistan, but again is exploiting the situation in Afghanistan to a greater degree. You see remnants of Al-Qaeda. Of course, the leader of Al-Qaeda was killed in downtown Kabul not that long after the Taliban took over and provided him safe haven, which turned out not to be all that safe, a few blocks from the Afghan governmental palace. Beyond that, though, I don't see threats of a truly international level, perhaps to a degree a regional level, as I've just described. But I don't see that expanding at this point in time beyond Afghanistan and to a degree Pakistan. Although it bears careful watching, the threats bear careful watching, and they are being carefully watched, which of course is how, in fact, the U.S. Was able to track down and then bring to justice the then leader of Al-Qaeda.
Is it fair to say, though, that given that Hamas and Al-Qaeda were amongst the first to congratulate the Taliban on its victory, so-called, in Afghanistan, is it fair to say that without their success there, regardless of how it happened, that we might not have such a bold Hamas, that Iran might also not be so bold, that Pakistan wouldn't be facing the re-emergent TTP as you've just described?
No, I think that's extrapolating a bit far. I think what's more likely is that Russia looked at the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and the way it was conducted, and then put that together, a number of factors beyond that probably led Russia to think that the U.S. and West would not respond as substantially as we have to the invasion of Ukraine. The other experiences might be the red line in Syria that turned out not to be a red line, the fairly tepid response to the 2014 Russian occupation of Crimea and support for the separatists in southeastern Ukraine, the fairly tepid response to actions in the South China Sea, to the Russian invasion of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, etc. So there are a number of cases, I think, in which the U.S. was seen as lacking either significant resolve or strategic patience, and correct to a degree, but obviously miscalculated when it came to trying to predict that the U.S. and the West would not do as much, remotely as much as we have, to support Ukraine in the face of the brutal and unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine. Beyond that, remember that President Xi seized on the withdrawal from Afghanistan as well and said, see, you can't count on the Americans. They're an undependable ally. And look how it went. They're clearly a great power in decline. Now, I think that the response to Ukraine and a variety of other actions since then provide indicators that contrast with that assessment. But again, you can see how what happens in one part of the world does reverberate elsewhere. In fact, that's one of the themes in our book, which is that what happens in one place can echo in other locations. So I remember I was actually in Southeast Asia when the red line turned out not to be a red line. And the prime minister of that country said, hey, General, What happens in the Middle East has reverberations out here in the East Asia Pacific region.
And yet we also have rising concerns about an emboldened Iran and its use of proxies across the Middle East. Are we going to be able to see Xi being kept out of Taiwan and Iran being kept out of a broader conflagration in the Middle East in coming weeks, months, years?
Well, the only proper way to answer that is to say that it depends. We have agency in each of those cases. We can take actions to ensure that deterrence in the Indo-Pacific is solid. I would contend that we're doing that. You know, when you spend whatever it is, approximately $15 billion a year just on hardening your bases, dispersing your forces, improving their defenses, and so forth, and then even vastly more to transform your capabilities in the ways that I've described, I think that helps to shore up deterrence very, very substantially. With respect to Iran, there's several different threats that it poses. One of those certainly is what you mentioned, the proxy elements that it has enabled to build such substantial capabilities, Hezbollah, militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and obviously Hamas in Gaza. But at the and of course, Iran is always very happy to fight to the last member of Gaza or Hezbollah or Iraqi militia. But I don't think they want to get into a direct conflict with the United States. That would be a losing proposition. They know it. That's particularly the case when the U.S. has two entire aircraft carrier task forces deployed in the greater Middle East, one in the Eastern Med and one which probably will end up outside the Gulf, as well as substantial augmentations of our Air Force capabilities in the region, air and ballistic missile defenses, other force protection measures, etc. So again, I think they will feel the edges of the U.S. and other countries that are active out there, but avoid a direct conflict, just as I think Hezbollah does not really want to get into a big slugfest with Israel again, the way that it did in 2006, and during which it was absolutely hammered. And we reassessed several times over the years the amount of damage that was done after initially generally concluding that the Israeli Air Force had overpromised and underdelivered, and it turned out that that was not correct. In fact, when I was at U.S. Central Command after Iraq and before Afghanistan, then when I was at the CIA, the assessments continued to evolve and continued to conclude that much more damage was done to Hezbollah and southern Lebanon infrastructure than was the case in the immediate aftermath of that particular conflict.
Well, a bit of a Hydra-headed question for our last question. So hindsight always comes with 2020. What would you have done in Afghanistan? What would you have advised Benjamin Netanyahu on October the 8th? And where does the world go from here?
Well, those are huge questions, and there's certainly more than one. So let me take Afghanistan first. What I would have done is gotten the inputs right a lot sooner than we did. As we lay out in the book, it took us 9 years from the invasion in late 2001 until late 2010 to get the inputs right. In other words, to get the right big ideas, the right overarching strategy. Now that began with my predecessor, General McChrystal, who for the first time really laid out a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign. We then needed to add additional elements of the organizational architecture because that wasn't right either for quite a long period of time. You know, all of this following a brilliant initial campaign to eliminate the al-Qaeda sanctuary, albeit with Osama bin Laden getting away at that time. We caught him in 2011 when I was the commander, and our special mission units and CIA conducted the operation that did bring him to justice in Abbottabad, Pakistan. But we also didn't get the right level of resources nearly right until late 2010. and even then it wasn't really all that we asked for, much less the preparation of our forces, the right leaders, and a variety of other elements that were missing, including just the amount of diplomats, spies, development workers, rule of law experts, and so forth. So again, it took us 9 years to get that right, in large measure because we, right after toppling the Taliban regime and eliminating the al-Qaeda sanctuary, shifted focus to Iraq, and Iraq consumed us really until the surge succeeded in 2007, 2008, and enabled us to draw down responsibly our forces in Iraq, and then enabled us to build up the forces in Afghanistan. So that's the answer on Afghanistan. And then beyond that, when it came, once we did get the inputs right, the right approach from there would have been to carry out conditions-based reductions of forces, not reductions that were a bit driven by other factors than the objective reality on the ground. And then at the point where we had only 3,500 troops left and we're spending less than $25 billion a year on the U.S. side, sustained that particular commitment, maybe beefed up some of the capabilities, the enablers, the drones, and the other systems that were so important to helping our Afghan partners on the ground, but recognizing that we hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months until that tragic suicide bombing killed 13 of our men and women in uniform at the gate to the international airport in Kabul during the withdrawal. And we easily could have sustained that particular commitment. All of our NATO and other partners would have stayed, and we could have kept the contractors there who turned out to be the critical element in the Afghan defense strategy, because they're the ones that maintained the systems that would take the Afghan commandos, 35,000 strong and well-trained and equipped, out to the front lines where the Taliban or Haqqani or other elements were threatening the much less well-trained and well-equipped police and army security forces. So again, that would have been the approach. We would still be on the ground. It would still be frustrating, maddening, unsatisfactory, but the nearly 40 million people we were seeking to support, by and large, would have been vastly better off than they are now. It's certainly the case for the 50% of the population that is basically not allowed to do anything meaningful outside the home without male escort. So, and then when it comes, your second question was with Israel and Hamas, what would I advise Prime Minister Netanyahu? This is what I have advised publicly and privately, which is that I agree that Hamas is an Islamist extremist organization similar to the Islamic State, and therefore has to be destroyed, noting that that analogy has some imperfections. There are elements of Palestinian nationalism, if you will, that are present there that weren't quite as present, say, when it came to the Islamic State and, say, the people of northern Iraq or northeastern Syria. So they have to be destroyed. And to do that, though, there should be a counterinsurgency campaign approach rather than just a conventional military approach, because from the very beginning, there has to be real concern about hearts and minds, about the necessity of performing not just offensive and defensive operations, but stability operations. That's the component of that distinguishes counterinsurgency from other types of campaigns. And it reminds you of the need to plan from the beginning, to clear and then hold, not clear and move on, and then immediately to begin rebuilding in the areas that you control, restoring basic services, reopening markets, schools, clinics, and so forth, because all of that is going to be necessary. And that leads to another element of the big ideas that should be laid out here. In addition to the mission given to the Israeli military, which is to destroy Hamas and dismantle the political wing, but it is then to prepare to take over, essentially, administration of Gaza, at least in the near term, because there is no other entity or grouping of countries or UN organization that is going to raise its hand and take over at least not in the interim. And keeping in mind that, again, in a counterinsurgency campaign, you also have to keep an eye on the remnants of the insurgents, in this case extremists, to ensure that even after they are destroyed, they cannot reconstitute themselves in the way that the Islamic State reconstituted itself after withdrawal of our final combat elements in Iraq in late 2011, and after the Iraqi security forces took their eye off them because of other tasks they were given by a sectarian prime minister. And then beyond that, they're connected with this as well, is that there should be a vision provided for the Palestinian people in Gaza, and I would submit also in the West Bank, but that life will be better in the same way that we provided a vision to the Sunni Arabs, and starting in Anbar province in Iraq, west of Baghdad, the home of Ramadi and Fallujah and a number of other very tough cities, each of which we cleared and held and rebuilt successfully during the course of the 18 months of the surge. And we were able to separate the people from the extremists by convincing them that if they helped us, or at least didn't impede us, as we sought to destroy al-Qaeda in Iraq and the major Sunni insurgent elements, that life would be better for them once those elements were in fact destroyed. And we ultimately reconciled with 103,000 Iraqis, 80,000 which were Sunni Arab, and then another 23,000 were Shia, who were in some way actively or tacitly supporting the Iranian-supported Shia militia, which we defeated in the second year, destroyed actually in the second year of the surge. So this is very important because, you know, the people haven't in the past had huge affection for Hamas. They know that Hamas is responsible for a lot of the violence that has been visited on them, although they, again, they'll have to be careful to avoid driving them into the arms of Hamas in the way that operations are carried out, to be sure. And I think, again, another element that should be laid out even more explicitly, it has been laid out, but that the Israeli forces will very strictly adhere to the laws of land warfare, purity of arms, it's called in their doctrinal terminology, because, again, at the end of this, the Israelis are going to end up owning Hamas, or they will end up owning Gaza, and need the people at least to not actively oppose them, if not actively support them. And so they're going to have to show that life will be better. And by the way, in part, in administering Gaza, there's likely going to have to be a degree of reconciliation, not with the Hamas military wing, nor with the political wing, but with the tens of thousands of what essentially are bureaucrats in Gaza who run the social services, the, again, provision of various basic services, whether it's power, water, and a variety of other tasks, civilian tasks, which the Israelis will need help in overseeing and help in providing, just as we needed help when we toppled the Saddam Hussein regime and all of the bureaucrats and ministers and so forth left their posts. And it wasn't until, so I was a division commander at the time, Great 101st Airborne Division. After the fight to Baghdad, we went north to Mosul and immediately set about determining how we could get them back to work, because they knew Iraq a heck of a lot better than we do. It turned out that we didn't have a sufficient understanding of Iraq and how it was supposed to function, how it really functioned, and that was particularly true in the area in which we ended up, because we hadn't prepared, hadn't been planning to be in northern Iraq. We'd been planning to be in west and south Baghdad. So again, I think those elements, those additional big ideas, if you will, that additional vision, I think is very important in this case. And the sooner that its elements are announced in broad terms and then in increasing detail, the better.
Well, just one more question. If you look at the Taliban's return to Afghanistan as a worst-case scenario, from my understanding, we now have 40 million people. Two-thirds of them are facing a grave humanitarian crisis. How much longer do you think there will be a tolerance for what is happening in Afghanistan under the Taliban, a tolerance for Taliban rule, and also a tolerance for the Taliban as a template for extremists elsewhere? Is this something that we can envisage coming to an end and ending in a way that doesn't create a regional implosion or even just a national implosion? Where do we go from here in Afghanistan to show that this isn't acceptable?
Well, I don't think that unless it poses a greater threat beyond the borders of Afghanistan, that there's going to be any desire whatsoever to go back into the land of the Hindu Kush. And I think what the intelligence agencies are watching very carefully, particularly the one that I was privileged to lead in my final government assignment, is whether or not there are extremist elements that will try to achieve the kind of capability that Al-Qaeda had when the 9/11 attacks were planned by Al-Qaeda in a sanctuary on Afghan soil. But I don't see that at present, and I don't see any enthusiasm whatsoever. However tragic and heartbreaking and downright disastrous the situation in Afghanistan is, I don't see any desire anywhere in the world to go in and topple the Taliban again and take on Afghanistan again, even if we might think we could do it a lot better with hindsight than the way we did it in the past.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, General. I really appreciate it. And,
pleasure is mine. Thanks.
Oh, well, thank you. And you. And congratulations again on the book. It's a good read and I would commend it.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with General Petreaus. He provided insights into modern war and the importance of strategy in leadership, and he talked too about the China threat, the politicisation of technology, the relevance of NATO, and much more. I hope you enjoyed it. Next time, I'll be talking to Sanjar Sohail, an Afghan journalist who won an Emmy Award for his investigative work on atrocities committed by the Taliban since they returned to power in Afghanistan. Until then, this is Lynne O'Donnell. Bye-bye.